The tow truck arrived 30 minutes later, its yellow lights adding to the carnival of colors, already lighting up the quiet neighborhood. By now, several residents had come out onto their porches to see what was happening. David stood on the sidewalk watching helplessly as the driver hooked chains to his Mercedes. "This is a mistake," he said for the 5th time, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. One phone call. That's all it would take. Out paperwork on the hood of his patrol car. "You keep saying that, but it's almost 1 in the morning. Nobody's answering phones at government offices right now. My department has people on duty 24 hours a day," David replied. "National security doesn't take breaks." Officer Davidson laughed. "National security? Come on, man. What are you, a secret agent?" David looked at him for a long moment. The irony wasn't lost on him that he couldn't answer that question honestly without potentially compromising an ongoing investigation. His team had spent months tracking a terrorist cell that was planning something big. The surveillance equipment. In his car, the multiple phones. The cache, it was all part of an elaborate operation that was supposed to conclude tomorrow morning. "I work for Homeland Security," David said finally, deciding that much truth was worth the risk. Torres looked up from his paperwork. "Homeland Security? Really?" "Yes, really." "Then where's your badge?" David felt his stomach sink. His official credentials were locked in the trunk of his car, along with his service weapon and the case files for Operation Nightfall.
Ow!
He'd learned early in his career never to carry official identification during undercover work. One slip, one moment of carelessness, and his cover could be blown. "It's in my trunk," he said. "How convenient," Davidson said. "Right there with your story about being a secret government agent." The tow truck driver walked over with a clipboard. "Where am I taking this beauty?" "City impound lot on 5th Street, Torres said, signing the release form. "Hold it pending investigation." David watched his car being lifted onto the truck bed. Inside that trunk were files containing the real names and addresses of 3 suspected terrorists who were planning to meet at a warehouse across town in less than 8 hours. Without those files, without his official credentials, without his backup weapon, the entire operation could fall apart. "Officers, please," David tried one more time. "I understand how this looks, but I'm asking you to trust me. Call the federal building downtown. Ask for the duty officer in counterterrorism. Tell them Agent David Johnson needs immediate assistance." Torres and Davidson exchanged glances. They'd heard plenty of creative stories over the years, but this one was getting more elaborate by the minute. "Agent Johnson?" Davidson's voice was mocking, like in the movies. "It's not a movie name," David said quietly. "It's my real name." As the tow truck pulled away with his Mercedes, David felt a growing sense of panic. Not for himself. He'd been in worse situations during his 15 years with the agency. But for the operation that was now in jeopardy, and for the innocent. People who might get hurt if they couldn't stop what was coming. Torres was writing out citations now, his pen moving quickly across the carbon paper. "Let's see. No proof of insurance, failure to provide proper identification, carrying a concealed weapon without permit verification. I told you, I have a federal carry permit, which you also can't produce," Davidson added. "Funny how all your documentation is always somewhere else." David knew there was no point in arguing further. These officers had made up their minds about who they thought he was, and nothing he said was going to change that. He'd seen it happen before. Good cops who let their assumptions cloud their judgment, who saw what they expected to see instead of what was actually in front of them. The radio in their patrol car crackled to life. "Unit 47. We've got a domestic disturbance on Oak Street. Can you respond?" Torres looked at his partner. "Need to wrap this up. What about him?" Davidson nodded toward David, issued the citations, and cut him loose. "The car is impounded, the weapons secured. He's not going anywhere." David accepted the stack of traffic tickets without looking at them. Each one was another obstacle between him and his mission, another delay that could cost lives. But he signed where they indicated and kept his mouth shut. "You got someone who can pick you up?" Torres asked, his tone slightly less hostile now that the paperwork was done. "I'll manage," David said. The 2 officers got back in their patrol car and drove away. leaving David standing alone under a streetlight. He pulled out his personal cell phone, one of the few things they hadn't confiscated, and stared at the screen. He had numbers he could call, people who could straighten this out, but every call he made would create a paper trail. Every official intervention would raise questions about what he'd been doing in this neighborhood at midnight. He started walking toward the main road, hoping to find a taxi or rideshare. As he walked, he thought about the files in his trunk. His team had been tracking these terrorists for months, following money transfers and intercepted communications. They'd finally identified the location where the group was planning to meet. And tomorrow's raid was supposed to shut down the entire cell. But without the detailed surveillance photos, without the layout of the warehouse, without his backup teams, contact information, all of which was in his car, the operation would have to be postponed. And in his experience, postponed operations rarely succeeded. Criminals had a way of sensing when law enforcement was closing in. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his partner, Agent Lisa Chen, who was probably wondering why he hadn't checked in after completing his surveillance run. "All clear on your end?" the message read. David stared at the phone for a long moment before typing back. "Slight delay. We'll explain tomorrow." He couldn't tell her what had really happened. Not over an unsecured phone line. But he knew she'd be worried. They all would be, when he didn't show up for the pre-dawn briefing. A taxi finally stopped for him. And as they drove through the empty streets toward his apartment, David found himself thinking about the look in Officer Torres's eyes. It wasn't malicious, the man was just doing his job as he understood it. But there had been something else there, something that suggested Torres had already decided what kind of person David was based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the time of night. It was a look David had seen before growing up. In Detroit, serving in the army, even sometimes within his own agency. The look that said, "You don't belong here. You don't deserve this. You must have gotten it through some illegal means." The taxi pulled up outside his apartment building. David paid the driver and walked slowly up the stairs, his mind already working on how to salvage tomorrow's operation. He had backup files at home, emergency contact numbers, alternative plans. The mission wasn't lost, not yet, but as he unlocked his front door, David couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed tonight. Not just with the operation, but with his own understanding of how the world saw him. Even after 15 years of serving his country, even with all his training and credentials and clearances, he was still just another suspicious black man driving an expensive car through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. David's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., but he'd been awake for hours. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, knowing he had to make a call that would change everything. The raid was supposed to begin in 3 hours, and his team was counting on the intelligence. Files that were now locked away in a city impound lot. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Deputy Director Patricia Williams had been his supervisor for 6 years, and she was one of the few people in the agency who truly understood the complexities of working undercover, while being a person of color in America. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered. "This better be important, David. It's not even 6 in the morning." "Director Williams, we have a problem with Operation Nightfall." There was a pause, and David could hear her sitting up in bed. "What kind of problem?" David took a deep breath and explained everything that had happened the night before. The traffic stop, the suspicious officers, the impounded car with all their critical evidence. As he spoke, he could hear the frustration building in her voice. "Let me get this straight," she said when he finished. "Our entire operation is compromised because 2 local cops decided you looked suspicious driving through a nice neighborhood. That's about the size of it, and they have your service weapon. Your credentials? The surveillance photos? Everything's in the trunk of my car, which is sitting in a city impound lot." Director Williams was quiet for a long moment. David could almost hear her mind working, calculating the implications. Operation Nightfall had taken 8 months to set up. They'd tracked money transfers, intercepted phone calls, placed surveillance on dozens of suspects. All of that work was now at risk because of a traffic stop that should never have happened. "How bad is the time crunch?" she asked. The targets are meeting at the warehouse at 9 a.m. Without the files, without the detailed floor plans, we can't move forward safely. And if we postpone? David looked out his window at the sunrise, beginning to paint the sky pink and orange. You know what happens when we postpone? They smell law enforcement and disappear. We've seen it a dozen times. Her voice became crisp and professional. I'm getting dressed now. Meet me at the federal building in 30 minutes. We're going to fix this. 25 minutes later, David stood in the lobby of the federal building downtown, watching Director Williams stride through the security checkpoint. She was a woman in her 50s who had worked her way up through the ranks of federal law enforcement at a time when very few women held positions of authority. She had silver hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of presence that made people pay attention when she walked into a room. Status report, she said without preamble as they got into the elevator. Been trying to reach my backup files, but most of the detailed surveillance work is on the secured drives in my trunk. Without those photos, we don't know the exact layout of the warehouse. It's the number of exits, the sight lines for our sharpshooters. The elevator doors opened on the 7th floor, and they walked quickly toward the counterterrorism division. Even at this early hour, the office was buzzing with activity. Agents in suits moved between cubicles, carrying coffee and case files. Preparing for the day's operations, Agent Lisa Chen looked up from her computer as they approached. She was David's partner, a former military intelligence officer who had joined Homeland Security 3 years earlier. Her desk was covered with printed surveillance photos and building blueprints. Thank God, she said when she saw David. I've been trying to piece together what we have without your files, but there are too many gaps. Director Williams pulled up a chair. Show me what we're missing. Lisa spread out the photos on her desk. We have exterior shots of the warehouse, but David's camera got the interior layout when he posed as a potential buyer last month. Without those photos, we don't know where they've set up their operations inside. She pointed to a blueprint of the building. This is from the city planning office, but it's 15 years old. Buildings get renovated, walls get moved, new entrances get added. David's surveillance showed them using a side entrance that doesn't appear on any official plans. Director Williams studied the maps and photos. What about the other agencies? FBI, ATF. They're ready to move when we give the signal, Lisa said. But they're relying on our intelligence for the tactical approach. David felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 3 suspected terrorists were planning something that could hurt innocent people. The only thing standing between them and their target was intelligence that was locked away because 2 cops had made assumptions about him. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Agent Johnson? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. Speaking, this is Sergeant Rodriguez from the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. I understand there was an incident last night involving your vehicle? David looked at Director Williams, who was listening intently. That's correct. I've been reviewing the paperwork and I have some questions. Can you come down to the station? Sergeant, I'm in the middle of a federal operation. Can this wait? I'm afraid not. There are some irregularities in the officer's report that need to be addressed immediately. Director Williams held out her hand for the phone. This is Deputy Director Patricia Williams, Department of Homeland Security. To whom am I speaking? David could hear the sergeant's voice change, becoming more formal. Ma'am, this is Sergeant Rodriguez. I'm investigating last night's incident. Sergeant, we need that vehicle released immediately. It contains materials critical to an ongoing national security operation. I understand, ma'am, but there are protocols we have to follow. The vehicle was impounded under suspicion of theft. Suspicion? Of theft? Director Williams's voice rose slightly. The vehicle is registered to one of my agents. What possible basis do you have for theft charges? There was a pause. Well, ma'am, the officers felt that the circumstances were suspicious. An expensive car, late at night, in a high-income neighborhood? You mean a black man driving an expensive car? Another pause, longer this time. Ma'am, I don't think race was a factor in their decision. Director Williams looked at David, her expression grim. They both knew that race had been the primary factor even if no one would admit it officially. Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm going to make this very simple for you. You have exactly 1 hour to release that vehicle and return all confiscated materials to Agent Johnson. If that doesn't happen, I'll be making phone calls to your chief, your mayor, and anyone else who will listen about how your department's racial profiling compromised a federal counterterrorism operation. Ma'am, I don't think threats are necessary. It's not a threat, Sergeant. It's a promise. How long do we need to review the files once we get them back? 30 minutes, maybe 45 if we're thorough. Director Williams checked her watch. It was 7:15 a.m. That puts us right at the edge of our window. David felt his phone buzzing with text messages. Other team members were checking in, asking for final confirmation of the operation. The message was a reminder of how many people were counting on this mission succeeding. What if they don't release the car in time? Lisa asked. Director Williams was already reaching for her phone. Then we go over their heads. I've got the police chief's direct number, and he owes me a favor from a joint operation we ran 2 years ago. As she dialed, David thought about the 3 men they'd been tracking. Intelligence suggested they were planning an attack on a crowded public location, possibly a shopping mall or transit station. Every minute of delay increased the risk that innocent people would be hurt. The morning sun was streaming through the office windows now, and David could see the city waking up below them. Commuters heading to work, children walking to school, people going about their normal lives, unaware that their safety might depend on whether a car could be retrieved from an impound lot in time. Director Williams slammed her phone down on Lisa's desk with enough force to make the coffee cups rattle. Her conversation with Police Chief Robert Martinez had not gone as planned. He's stonewalling us, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Claims his hands are tied by department policy. Says the vehicle can't be released without a court order. David felt his stomach drop. A court order? That could take days. Not if I have anything to say about it. Director Williams was already scrolling through her contacts. Lisa, what's our time situation? Lisa checked her watch. 7:45. The targets are supposed to meet at 9. Even if we get the files right now, we're cutting it extremely close. The office around them had become a flurry of activity. Agents were making last-minute preparations for the raid, checking equipment, and reviewing backup plans. But everyone knew that without David's detailed surveillance files, they were going in half-blind. Director Williams found the number she was looking for. Federal Judge Nancy Harper, she explained to David as the phone rang. She's been on the bench for 20 years and doesn't tolerate nonsense from anyone. Judge Harper, this is Patricia Williams from Homeland Security. I need an emergency court order, and I need it in the next 30 minutes. David could hear the judge's voice through the phone, but couldn't make out the words. Director Williams quickly explained the situation, the impounded vehicle, the critical evidence, the time-sensitive operation. Yes, Your Honor, I understand the unusual nature of the request, Director Williams said. But we're talking about preventing a potential terrorist attack on civilian targets. There was a long pause while the judge considered the situation. David found himself holding his breath, knowing that everything depended on this one phone call. Thank you, Your Honor. We'll be there in 15 minutes. She hung up and grabbed her jacket. Judge Harper will sign an emergency release order, but we have to appear before her in person. She wants to hear the details directly from the agent involved. 20 minutes later, David found himself standing in Judge Harper's chambers, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. The judge was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. Agent Johnson, she said, looking up from the paperwork Director Williams had provided. Tell me about this operation. David chose his words carefully, knowing that even in these circumstances, he couldn't reveal too many operational details. Your Honor, we've been tracking a domestic terrorist cell for 8 months. Intelligence indicates they're planning an attack today on a civilian target. The specific details of their location and methods are in files that were confiscated during my traffic stop last night. And you were working undercover? Yes, ma'am. I was conducting surveillance on the suspect's meeting location. Judge Harper studied the police report from the traffic stop. Officers Torres and Davidson seemed to think you were engaged in criminal activity. David felt a familiar knot in his stomach. Even here, in a federal judge's chambers, he had to defend his right to drive through a neighborhood without being assumed to be a criminal. Your Honor, I was driving home from work. I have no criminal record, no history of illegal activity. My vehicle is properly registered and insured. The only reason I was stopped was because the officers found my presence in that neighborhood suspicious. Judge Harper's expression didn't change. But David caught something in her eyes that suggested she understood exactly what he was saying. Director Williams, the judge said, "What are the consequences if this operation is delayed?" "The targets will likely disappear, Your Honor, in our experience. Terrorist cells are extremely sensitive to any hint of law enforcement interest. If they suspect they're being watched, they'll abandon their current plans and go underground. It could take months or years to track them down again. And in the meantime, it could strike somewhere else, at a time and place of their choosing." Judge Harper signed the court order with a flourish. "Agent Johnson, I'm sorry this happened to you. No one should be treated as a criminal simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time." By 8:15, David and Director Williams were standing in the police station lobby, court order in hand. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at the front desk, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I have the release paperwork ready," he said, not quite meeting David's eyes. "The vehicle is being brought around from the impound lot now." "What about the confiscated items?" Director Williams asked. "Everything will be returned exactly as it was confiscated." David felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they were still running out of time. Even if everything went perfectly from this point forward, they would barely make their deadline. "There is one more thing," Sergeant Rodriguez said hesitantly. "Officers Torres and Davidson have been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation." Director Williams raised an eyebrow. "What kind of investigation?" "There." Supervisor reviewed the dashboard camera footage from last night. "There are some concerns about their conduct during the traffic stop." David wasn't surprised. He'd assumed the entire encounter had been recorded, and he'd been careful to remain calm and cooperative throughout the ordeal. If anything inappropriate had happened, it would be on video. A uniformed officer appeared in the lobby, carrying a box of David's belongings. His service weapon, his surveillance equipment, his cell phones. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it. "Agent Johnson?" The officer held out a clipboard. "I need you to sign here confirming that all items have been returned." David quickly inventoried the contents of the box. Everything was there, including the encrypted flash drives containing the warehouse surveillance photos. He signed the paperwork and followed Director Williams out to the parking lot where his Mercedes was waiting. As they drove back toward the federal building, David's phone started ringing. It was Lisa. "Please tell me you have the files," she said without preamble. "I've got them." "How much time do we have?" 20 minutes to review everything and brief the tactical teams." "It's going to be tight, but we can make it work." David felt the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease for the first time in hours. The operation could still succeed, despite everything that had gone wrong. David, Director Williams said as they pulled into the federal building parking garage. "What happened to you last night was completely unacceptable. Those officers had no legitimate reason to stop you, let alone impound your vehicle." "It's not the first time something like this has happened," David said quietly. "That doesn't make it right." They rode the elevator up to the 7th floor in silence. David was already thinking ahead to the raid, to the tactical briefing, to the dozens of details that would need to be coordinated in the next few minutes. But part of his mind was still, back on that dark street in Willowbrook, standing beside his car while two officers decided he didn't belong there. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into the bustling activity of the counterterrorism division. Lisa was waiting for them with a laptop computer and a stack of printed surveillance photos. "Ready to save the day?" she asked with a tired smile. David plugged in his encrypted flash drive and watched as dozens of detailed photos filled the computer screen. Interior shots of the warehouse, escape routes, defensive positions, everything the tactical teams would need to plan their approach. "Now we're talking," Lisa said, studying the images. "This changes everything." As David began explaining the layout to the assembled agents and tactical officers, he felt a familiar surge of professional satisfaction. This was why he did the job, to protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. Everything else, all the frustration and humiliation of the past 12 hours faded into the background. The operation was back on track. 3 months later, David sat in a wood-paneled conference room on Capitol Hill, adjusting his tie nervously as cameras clicked around him. The House Committee on Homeland Security had called him to testify about racial profiling in law enforcement, and the events of that night in Willowbrook had become a national talking point. Agent Johnson, Congresswoman Helen Rodriguez leaned forward at the microphone. "In your own words, can you describe what happened on the night of March 15th? David had told this story dozens of times now to internal investigators, to civil rights groups, to journalists. But sitting here in front of television cameras and elected officials still felt surreal. I was driving home after completing a surveillance operation," he began, his voice steady despite the bright lights. "Two police officers pulled me over in what they later admitted was a routine traffic stop. Despite my cooperation and attempts to explain my profession, they chose to impound my vehicle and confiscate materials critical to an ongoing counterterrorism investigation." The room was completely silent, except for the soft whir of cameras. David had learned to stick to the facts, to let the story speak for itself without editorial commentary. "And what was the impact of this delay on your operation?" asked Congressman James Miller, a former prosecutor who had been following the case closely. "We were able to complete the mission, but just barely. The suspects we'd been tracking for 8 months were arrested at their meeting location, preventing what intelligence suggested would have been an attack on a crowded shopping center." David paused, remembering the chaos of that morning. The tactical teams had moved in at exactly 9 a.m., just as the 3 suspects were unloading suspicious packages from a van. The warehouse raid had been flawless, but only because they'd managed to review the surveillance files with minutes to spare. "But the delay nearly compromised everything," he continued. "If we hadn't been able to recover those files in time, innocent people could have been hurt." Congresswoman Rodriguez shuffled through her notes. "Agent Johnson, you've served your country for 15 years. You've received commendations for your work in counterterrorism, yet 2 police officers assumed you were a criminal based solely on your appearance and the time of night. How does that make you feel?" David had been dreading this question. He'd spent his entire career trying to separate his personal experiences from his professional duties, trying to be seen as an agent first and a black man second. But that night in Willowbrook had forced him to confront the reality that the world didn't always see him the way he saw himself. "It's frustrating," he said carefully. "I've dedicated my life to protecting this country and its citizens. Are still people who see me as a threat, rather than as someone working to keep them safe." The hearing room erupted in camera flashes. David knew that quote would be on the evening news and in tomorrow's newspapers. After the hearing, David walked out into the bright sunshine of a Washington spring afternoon. His phone had been buzzing with messages all morning, colleagues offering support, family members who had watched the hearing on television, journalists wanting interviews. Director Williams was waiting for him on the courthouse steps. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Tired," David said honestly. "Ready for this to be over?" "It's never really over," she said. "But maybe some good will come from it." She was right, David realized. The case had already led to changes. The Willowbrook Police Department had implemented new training programs on implicit bias. Officer Torres and Davidson had been fired and were facing federal civil rights charges. Police departments across the country were reviewing their traffic stop procedures. But David knew that real change would take more than new policies and training seminars. It would require people to examine their own assumptions and prejudices, to question whether their split-second judgments were based on facts or stereotypes. 6 months after the hearing, working a new case involving suspected arms dealers in Baltimore, he was sitting in his car outside a warehouse, conducting surveillance, when his phone rang. "Agent Johnson. This is Officer Rebecca Martinez with the Baltimore Police Department." David tensed slightly. He'd learned to be wary of unexpected calls from local law enforcement. "We've been monitoring suspicious activity at the same location you're watching," Officer Martinez continued. "My supervisor thought we should coordinate our efforts rather than risk interfering with each other." David was surprised. In the past, Local police and federal agents often worked parallel investigations without much communication. This level of cooperation was unusual. That would be helpful, David said. What have you observed? The next 20 minutes, they shared intelligence and coordinated their surveillance positions. Officer Martinez was professional, respectful, and clearly knowledgeable about the case. At no point did she question David's presence or ask for additional identification. As they talked, David realized that this was what proper police work looked like. Officers focused on the evidence, not assumptions. Agencies working together, instead of at cross purposes. Respect for fellow law enforcement professionals, regardless of their race or background. The Baltimore operation was a success. They arrested 5 suspects and seized enough illegal weapons to supply a small army. Local news coverage praised the cooperation between federal agents and city police, highlighting it as a model for future joint operations. A year later, David received an unexpected phone call. It was Officer Torres, one of the cops who had stopped him that night in Willowbrook. Agent Johnson, Torres said, his voice hesitant. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted to apologize. David was quiet for a moment, not sure how to respond. I've been going through sensitivity training as part of my appeal process, Torres continued. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that night. I realize now that I let my assumptions guide my actions instead of the facts. I appreciate you calling, David said, though he wasn't sure he meant it. I'm not trying to excuse what I did, Torres said, but I want you to know that I'm working to be better. I've been volunteering with community groups, trying to understand how my actions affect people like you. After Torres hung up, David sat in his office thinking about the conversation. He wasn't ready to forgive the man who had nearly derailed a crucial operation and subjected him to public humiliation, but he could respect someone who was willing to admit their mistakes and work to do better. 2 years after the Willowbrook incident, David was promoted to senior agent and assigned to train new recruits. Part of his curriculum included a case study about the importance of interagency cooperation and the dangers of making assumptions during investigations. He never mentioned that he was the agent in the case study, but he watched carefully as the young recruits discussed what had gone wrong and how it could have been prevented. Most of them understood immediately that racial bias had played a role in the officers' decision-making. A few needed more explanation. The key lesson David would tell each class is that good police work is based on evidence, not assumptions. The moment you start making decisions based on what someone looks like rather than what they've done, you've stopped being a good cop. One evening, David was driving home through a neighborhood not unlike Willowbrook when he saw police lights in his rearview mirror. For just a moment, he felt that familiar knot in his stomach. But the officer who approached his window was young, professional, and polite. License and registration, please, she said. I stopped you because your taillight appears to be out. Handed over his documents and watched as she examined them carefully. She never questioned his right to be in the neighborhood, never asked what he did for work, never suggested that anything about the situation was suspicious. You're all set, Agent Johnson, she said, handing back his identification. Just get that taillight fixed when you have a chance. As she walked back to her patrol car, David smiled. Change was happening, slowly but surely. One traffic stop at a time, one training session at a time, one conversation at a time. It wasn't perfect. And it wasn't fast enough, but it was progress. And for now, that would have to be enough. It was almost 9:30 on a Tuesday evening when lawyer Maya Richardson finally left her downtown office. She had been working on a complicated case that kept her busy way past her usual hours. The city's streets were mostly empty as she drove her black sedan through the quiet neighborhoods. Heading home after another long day, Maya loved her job as a state prosecutor. She had worked hard to get where she was, spending years studying law, passing the bar exam, and climbing her way up. In the district attorney's office, at 32, she was one of the youngest senior prosecutors in the state, handling some of the most important cases that came through the courthouse. Tonight had been particularly challenging. She had been preparing for a big trial that was starting next week, going through witness statements and evidence until her eyes were tired from reading. Her briefcase sat in the passenger seat, stuffed with legal documents and case files that she would probably review again at home. As she drove through Maple Heights, one of the nicer neighborhoods in the city, Maya noticed how peaceful everything looked. The streetlights created a warm glow over the well-kept houses and perfectly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of neighborhood where families felt safe walking their dogs at night and children rode their bikes without worry. Maya had been through this area many times before. Some of her colleagues lived here, and she had attended dinner parties and work gatherings in these very streets. She knew the neighborhood well and had never had any problems driving through it, even late at night. But tonight felt different somehow. As she stopped at a red light, Maya glanced in her rearview mirror and noticed a police car had pulled up behind her. The officer seemed to be looking directly at her car, though she couldn't see his face clearly through the windshield. When the light turned green, Maya continued driving at the speed limit, being extra careful to follow all the traffic rules. She had learned long ago that it was always better to be cautious when police were around, especially late at night. But even though she was driving perfectly normally, the patrol car stayed right behind her, following her every turn. After a few blocks, Maya started to feel uncomfortable. The police car was so close she could see the officer's face in her mirror. He appeared to be a white man, probably in his 40s, with a stern expression that made her nervous. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself that maybe the officer was just heading in the same direction she was. But then the red and blue lights started flashing. Maya's heart sank as she heard the familiar sound of a police siren. She pulled over to the side of the road, her hands already beginning to shake slightly. Even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong, getting pulled over always made her anxious. As a black woman, she had experienced her share of uncomfortable encounters with law enforcement over the years. She turned off her engine and placed both hands on the steering wheel. It's just like her father had taught her when she first started driving. "Keep your hands where they can see them," he had always said. "Don't give them any reason to think you're dangerous." Officer Derek Walsh stepped out of his patrol car and walked slowly toward Maya's vehicle. Even in the darkness, she could see that he looked tense and suspicious. His hand rested on his belt, close to his weapon, as if he expected trouble. Maya rolled down her window and waited. She had been through traffic stops before, and she knew the routine. Usually officers would ask for her license and registration, maybe write a ticket and send her on her way. She hoped this would be one of those quick, simple interactions. But when Officer Walsh reached her window, his first words surprised her. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, shining his flashlight directly into her face. Maya blinked, temporarily blinded by the bright light. "I'm sorry, officer. I was just driving home from work. Did I do something wrong?" Walsh kept the flashlight pointed at her, making it hard for her to see his expression. "This is a nice neighborhood," he said slowly. "It's not the kind of place where we usually see ... people like you driving around this time of night." The comment hit Maya like a punch to the stomach. She had heard words like these before, but it never got easier. She took a deep breath and tried to keep her voice calm and professional. "I work downtown," she explained. "I was just heading home. I live about 10 minutes from here." Officer Walsh walked around to the front of her car, examining it carefully with his flashlight. Maya watched him through her windshield, wondering what he was looking for. Her car was clean and well-maintained, with current registration stickers. And no visible problems. "Nice car," Walsh said when he returned to her window. "Pretty expensive for someone your age. Sure this belongs to you?" Maya felt her face getting hot with anger and embarrassment, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Yes, sir. It's my car. Would you like to see my registration?" "I'll need to see your license and registration," Walsh said, finally getting to the standard request. But the way he said it sounded more like an accusation than a routine traffic stop procedure. Maya reached carefully into her purse, moving slowly so the officer wouldn't think she was reaching for anything dangerous. She found her wallet and pulled out her driver's license, then opened her glove compartment to get her registration and insurance papers. As she handed the documents to Officer Walsh, she noticed how he looked at her license photo, then back at her face as if he was trying to catch her in some kind of lie. "Maya Richardson," he read aloud. "Says here you live on Oak Street. That's not in this neighborhood." "No, sir," Maya replied, Was driving through this area on my way home from work. I work late sometimes. Walsh studied her license for what seemed like an unusually long time. Maya sat in her car, watching him examine the small plastic card as if it contained some kind of secret code. "What kind of work keeps you out this late?" he asked suspiciously. Maya hesitated for a moment. In her experience, telling police officers that she was a lawyer sometimes made things better, but sometimes it made things worse. Some officers respected her profession, while others seemed to take it as a personal challenge. "I work for the district attorney's office," she said carefully. "I'm a prosecutor." Officer Walsh laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. "A prosecutor, really? That's what you're going with?" The disbelief in his voice was clear, and Maya felt her professional composure starting to crack. She had spent years earning her law degree, passing the bar exam, and building her career. She'd prosecuted criminals, worked with police departments, and earned the respect of judges and colleagues throughout the state. And here was this officer acting like her profession was some kind of joke. "Yes, sir," she said firmly. "I prosecute criminal cases for the state." Walsh shook his head and walked back toward his patrol car, taking her license and registration. With him, Maya watched in her side mirror as he got into his vehicle, probably running her information through the police computer system. She sat there in the darkness, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to understand what was happening. She had been driving normally, following all traffic laws, minding her own business. She lived in this city, worked for the government, paid her taxes, and contributed to her community. So why was she being treated like a criminal? The minutes ticked by slowly as Officer Walsh remained in his car. Aya glanced at the clock on her dashboard and realized that he had been checking her information for almost 15 minutes. Most traffic stops took only a few minutes, just long enough to verify that the driver had a valid license and current registration. Finally, she saw Walsh getting out of his patrol car again. He walked back toward her window, but this time his expression looked even more hostile than before.